Trump's warning about NATO are sending shock waves through Europe, forcing the EU to reconsider its security reliance on the US, with Washington demanding higher defense spending and hinting at a reduced American role. Is Europe finally ready to take charge of its own security, or is this a crisis that weakens transatlantic stability? Meanwhile, in the US, newly confirmed HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is making waves with his controversial public health agenda. From vaccine skepticism to investigating pharmaceutical regulations, his radical vision could reshape American healthcare. Are we witnessing a global shift in leadership and policy? Let's get in focus. Trump's skepticism of NATO isn't new, but his latest demands for massive defense spending increase and threats of disengagement are shaking European security. As fears grow over a US withdrawal, European leaders are debating a bold but overdue move: an independent European defense force. Is this a necessary wake-up call or a geopolitical crisis? Now, according to Politico, Trump's unpredictability is pushing Europe towards self-reliance. His repeated threats to cut US support for NATO and his demands for increased defense spending are forcing the EU to grow up and take control of its own security. While some fear that Trump's stance could embolden adversaries like Russia, the authors believe that this is a long overdue opportunity for Europe to strengthen its military and reduce its reliance on Washington. But can the EU truly unite around a common defense strategy? Right, to discuss this, we are joined by Professor Gilles-Emmanuel Jacquet, a geopolitical analyst and Vice President of the Geneva International Peace Research Institute. Professor Jacquet, welcome to In Focus. If I may ask you, Trump's rhetoric on NATO has caused major concern among European leaders. Do you see this as a negotiating tactic, or is the US genuinely shifting away from traditional security commitments?
Good evening. Thanks for your invitation. Yes, the recent developments with regard to the negotiations with regard to conflict in Ukraine, they seem to indicate an important shift, a significant shift, not just in diplomacy, but more generally as well in the international order. And for such type of conflict occurring in Europe, we would expect European countries, especially European countries supporting Ukraine, to be invited. But it's not the case, and it seems to indicate what some experts call, with regard to EU countries, a form of diplomatic irrelevance. And it's very surprising, especially as well with regard to France, to not be part of these negotiations, or even as well for Switzerland. It's not an EU country, but Switzerland usually, by tradition, hosts important negotiations with regard to conflicts, as it was the case for Syria, for the previous phases of the Ukrainian conflict.
Now, European leaders are now discussing the need for an independent defense force. Do you think Europe is ready for this, or are divisions among EU nations are too deep?
Well, you're right. First of all, there are divisions. We know that Slovakia, Hungary, for example, or Italy as well, to some extent, are quite reluctant to provide more support for the war to Ukraine. Even Poland is reluctant to send troops in Ukraine, while Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said that he would like to send troops there. So we have divisions in Europe. Sure, it's not very helpful if EU countries want to have a common position in negotiations. And you have as well a meeting summoned by Emmanuel Macron, and France and other EU countries are rather opposing peace negotiations, and they are rather signaling their will to continue to support the Ukrainian war effort. So it's not going to be very, very helpful for European countries if they want to have an influence in the negotiations with regard to the conflict in non-European countries seem to be more important. If I may, when I was mentioning non-European countries, I'm mentioning countries like China or happening.
But do you think will they be able to have an independent defense force?
That's a very old question as well in the European Union, in the history of European construction. There were previous attempts that failed, like the European Community of Defense. And there were different attempts as well to strengthen the defense capacities of EU as a whole. You already have agreements, you have cooperation, but once again, when it comes to have a real strategic independence, because it would go as well with go with the attempt to build an independent or strategic military force in Europe. It's not there. You have disagreements in EU countries, among EU countries, about strategic goals or the strategic interests. First of all, about their national interests, that are not necessarily the same. And as well, what would constitute a kind of EU national or strategic interest. So you have divisions among European countries. And moreover, you have a problem of resource. Many EU countries need to commit more resources, not just to NATO, but to their to the buildup or the strengthening of the capacities of their armed forces. So it's going to be a huge challenge. And I think right now, even though France would like to build such kind of new defense community in the EU, I'm not sure there will be something really tangible, especially as most EU countries are NATO members. And you have the Berlin Plus Agreement of 2003, stating that for defense capacities, for EU defense capacities, you have cooperation with NATO. And in fact, it's not just a cooperation, because most defense and security issues are between the hands of NATO and not really in the hands of the European Union.
Now, some analysts argue that Trump's stance could embolden Russia by weakening NATO's deterrence power. What do you have on that?
Well, I don't know if Trump's stance will necessarily, especially with regard to Russia, will necessarily undermine the capacities of NATO. First of all, we know that President Trump thinks that the USA are paying too much for NATO. And he wants EU countries or other, let's say, NATO members, that are most of them EU countries, to pay more, to commit more resources to NATO. There is as well another thing. There is disagreement between President Trump and most EU leaders who would like to continue war, while the US president stated several times that he's more in favor of trade relations or trade confrontation, but not necessarily in favor of armed conflicts or more wars. I would say that this channel of negotiation that is mainly between two big powers, Russia and the US, it looks like Yalta, a new Yalta, where big powers make deals and lesser powers or smaller countries just have to follow. So it's not as well good news for EU countries who had ambitions to be more significant, diplomatically speaking. But once again, if we look at the conflict in Ukraine or the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it seems that the EU is ineffective, and this long ineffectiveness paved the way for this kind of maybe not new bipolar order, but new leadership, this new US-Russian leadership, especially over Eurasian crisis.
You mean here that the United States' influence is getting much better, much bigger than the EU's abilities and and that the influence of countries like Russia, China, and other actors are getting more than the Europeans as actors?
Well, the US president made it clear in his first mandate and in his second mandate that he would like to make, as he said, America great again. What does it mean to, in fact, to preserve US leadership? However, his vision about US global leadership is not the same vision as the one of President Biden or the Democrats or even other neoconservatives among the Republican Party, historically speaking. He wants to preserve. Yes, sorry.
Yes. No, I may ask you here, if the US reduces its military presence in Europe, how might countries like Germany and France respond? And could we see the emergence of a truly independent European defense alliance at then?
Well, there may be less in the future US troops in Europe. It's a move that was as well initiated before President Trump. It won't be good news for Germany or other NATO members, because here it's not just about EU, it's more about NATO as well, because they could lose military resources, fundings, we should commit more resources. Many as well European armies face great challenges. The German army or the French armies, they have operational problems, they have capacity problems, resource problems, manpower as well problems. So it's not really good news for them, because they have to commit more resources. I'm not sure they are able, especially given the current economic crisis we have in Germany, we have in France, and other countries. So it's in fact raising many questions about the strategic future of EU countries and NATO. And I'm not sure that we will see soon independent European Union in strategic terms. I'm not sure.
Now, looking forward, and as you said, could this be or these policies be a kind of turning point for the transatlantic relations? Or is Trump's approach a short-term disruption that Europe will have to manage until the next US elections?
It's a very good question. Maybe it could be both. We don't know who will be the next US president, and we don't know in 4 years how the USA will be, how US citizens will feel with regard to not President Trump, who won't be able to be re-elected because of the US Constitution, but maybe Vice President Vance or another similar person. However, it's true that it's a turning point in the transatlantic relation. It's a very important turning as well, but EU countries are not really the US partner, I would say. So once again, it looks more like New Yalta, where you have a deal between big powers or big powers that consider themselves as the most relevant. So it's namely Russia and the US in this case, but it could be as well China or other powers.
Mm-hmm. Professor, Professor Gilles-Emmanuel Jacquet, thank you so much for your very valuable insights here. And it's clear that Trump's policies are forcing Europe to rethink its security, and the choice made now could define transatlantic relations for years to come. While Europe grapples with security uncertainties, the US is facing its own shake-up in public health. With the RFK Jr. now leading the Department of Health and Human Services, his radical views on vaccines and healthcare policy are setting the stage for a major battle in Washington.
Donald Trump is his name, and he's there to stay.
As unlikely, impossible, is now reality.
America powerful. We will win, win, win. And we will make America great again. quickly make America great again.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has built his career questioning mainstream public health policies. Now, as HHS Secretary, he is vowing to upend the system challenging vaccine mandates, pharmaceutical regulations, and even the medical establishment itself. Is this a long overdue reckoning over a dangerous experiment? Now, according to Qnews Max, RFK Jr. is wasting no time reshaping the Department of Health and Human Services. His first address to staff made it clear everything is up for debate, from vaccine policies to pharmaceutical regulations. While supporters see this as a push for transparency and accountability, critics warn that his skepticism of vaccine and unconventional medical views could weaken public trust in science. Is this a necessary reform or a public health crisis in the making? And to break this down, we are joined by Mr. James Pinkerton, columnist, author, and political analyst. Mr. James, good evening to you, sir, and welcome to In Focus. Now, RFK Jr. has long been critical of vaccine mandates, and as HHC Secretary now, do you think he'll be able to reshape federal policy or on vaccine, or will he face too much resistance?
Well, thank you for having me. The U.S. healthcare industry is $5 trillion. Of course, vaccines are just a piece of that. But I mean, we're talking about the biggest of battleships, and as they say about battleships, they move around only very slowly. And I think Secretary Kennedy has strong views on this, but other people have strong views too. I noted during the confirmation hearings that Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, who's the chairman of the Health Committee in the U.S. Senate, had a long list of concerns and stipulations, and among them he said, speaking for the Senate, want say-so on personnel choices. I want advance clearance on announcements. I want you to come and testify once a quarter before the Senate, what they call the Health Committee. So there's, in the American system, there are so many checks and balances according to the Constitution and according to just all of the yeast and pluralism of American society that I'm thrilled that Secretary Kennedy will get a chance to make his arguments. I'm also thrilled that the counterpoint of view, including Senator Cassidy, will also get to make his arguments. That's the American way to debate it out and hope and trust that the truth will emerge.
Now, his agenda includes investigating pharmaceutical pricing and medical research funding. Could this lead to meaningful reform, or is it more about political posturing?
Well, here again, I mean, the budget of the Department of Health and Human Services, depending on how you measure it, is about $3 trillion all in, $3 trillion, and so that including Social Security. Look, Secretary Kennedy is going to try and do all the things you said, and there's been a huge loss of confidence among the American public in, for example, vaccines, the COVID vaccine. I mean, again, the general feeling is the vaccine itself was probably a good idea, but the government under the previous administration way oversold it as something that everybody ought to get. Probably the proper strategy was to administer the vaccine to the vulnerable and to leave the healthy alone and not sweep them into the same edict. I think that was a huge mistake, and I think all the lockdowns and close downs were a big mistake and much to be regretted. So it's going to be a while before the public health establishment, of which Secretary Kennedy is now the head of, is able to regain the confidence of the American people on this issue. And then the second issue is sort of related, speaking of COVID, and that's the origins of the COVID virus. I mean, there's a substantial view in America, including led by Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who's the chairman of the House, probably the Senate Oversight Committee. He's digging deep into this Wuhan lab issue, and again, an argument that the virus came from a Chinese lab, 5 years ago, and that was seen as an extreme conspiracy theory. Now it's generally regarded as the simple truth. And so all the officials who were saying, oh, no, it's just a conspiracy theory, don't worry about that, have to explain themselves now. And again, I can't think of a better investigator than Secretary Kennedy to say, listen, why were you so wrong? Explain to me and to the American people why we should take your word for it now when you clearly made a big, epic, civilization-changing mistake just a few years ago.
Well, but here, Mr. Kennedy has framed his mission as a fight against corporate influence in public health. So do you think he's genuinely challenging big pharma, or could his policies have unintended consequences?
Well, I mean, look, he's certainly been around power and politics literally all his life. His uncle was elected president when he was 9 years old, and he's been to the Oval Office as a teenager, and then had a father and another uncle who were also U.S. senators. So Kennedy understands the game of Washington pretty well. He's very much an outsider, but he also had an insider background. So I mean, look, here we are in Washington and around the world watching this, because we understand that these decisions and arguments being made about the vaccines not only apply to American public health, but apply to the world's public health. I mean, and so they're all important questions. And again, as somebody who's obviously, anybody interested in healthcare was following this pretty closely. There's a lot of lessons to learn from around the world. I mean, for example, Sweden had a much different COVID policy than the United States did, and I think it's been vindicated as actually better. And so I hope that Secretary Kennedy and the Trump administration and the U.S. Senate and the Congress and the public health establishment overall are paying close attention to successes around the world on these issues, even as they try to zero in on this seemingly insane policy of gain of function research, which had the U.S. government funding scientists how to make a more deadly virus. That doesn't strike me as a very good idea, and I would love to see more open hearings, in legal and also political courts, just to say, what were you thinking when you funded somebody to figure out how to make a virus that can kill people better?
Mr. James, the critics or his critics argue that his stance on vaccines could lead to a decline in public trust in immunization programs. And how much of risk does this pose to the national public health?
Well, there is a risk. There's no question. I mean, depending on how you feel about vaccines, vaccine non-compliance, has been an issue in American politics for a long time. It used to be sort of a left-wing issue when Kennedy was seen himself as kind of a left-winger, and now it's become sort of a right-wing issue. And maybe it's both. Maybe it is just a genuine question as to the utility of vaccines. I personally am pro-vaccine, but again, I wasn't elected president, and I wasn't appointed Secretary of the Health and Human Services Department. So it is, in all cases, on any issue, including, for example, climate change, there's just, I think, no such thing as settled science on these matters. It's always in evolution. It's always new information to learn. And so if the public health establishment wishes to keep to its position on vaccines, which I think is a good way to go about it, they need to recognize they have to go out and persuade.
Well, of course, that will need more and more debates, and we're looking forward to see what would this result in. Mr. James Pinkerton, thank you so much for your analysis here, and RFK's JR's leadership at HHS is shaping up to be one of the most controversial policy shifts in recent years, one that could have lasting implications for public health. From Trump's NATO winnings to RFK's GR's radical health policies, today's episode highlights two major shifts reshaping global politics and policy. Is Europe ready to take control of its own security? Will RFK Jr. revolutionize the public health or undermine it? We will be watching closely, so stay with us for more critical insights. See you next time on In Focus. I'm Mona Musalhi. Many thanks for watching.